When a policeman finds a girl crying in the trash, he doesn't hesitate to rescue her, but soon realizes she's exactly what was missing in his life. He starts the process to formally adopt her. Years later, he gets the scare of his life. Stay tuned to discover what happens next. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories. The sun was starting to rise when Tom, tired, headed from his car to his apartment building. He had just finished his night patrol shift at the local police station and was ready to sleep. As he passed by a dumpster, he heard a strange noise but initially thought it was just rats or other creatures rummaging through the trash. But then he heard the noise again, and stopped in his tracks. He was sure he had just heard the unmistakable cry of a baby. He stood still and silent, waiting for the noise again. When he heard it once more, he knew it was definitely the cry of a baby. Tom hurriedly ran towards the row of dumpsters, trying to locate the source of the noise. When he lifted the lid of the farthest dumpster, he was frozen in shock. Atop the pile of trash was a baby wrapped in blankets. Tom quickly pulled the baby out of the trash, holding her by the pink blankets and floral pajamas. He guessed it was a girl. He hugged her and calmed her down for a few minutes until she stopped crying. Tom then carefully placed her on the ground and gently unwrapped the blankets, looking for any signs of injury. The girl's hands kept reaching out to him, and a small smile appeared on her face. Pleased to find no injuries, he wrapped her up again and decided to take her to the hospital. At the hospital, the nurses confirmed the girl was healthy. However, since there was no legal guardian present, they had to inform the authorities, who would likely place the baby in an orphanage if they couldn't find her parents. Tom looked at the girl he had just rescued and couldn't bear the thought of her being raised in the foster care system. There was something about the girl that had completely captivated him, and he knew exactly what he wanted to do. When the social worker arrived at the hospital, he told her that he wished to adopt the girl. The social worker was shocked. It was a very unusual situation, and she had no experience with such cases. However, she told Tom that if he passed all the checks and the baby's parents were not found, then the baby could stay with him in foster care while he started the official adoption process. Tom was thrilled with the news and wasted no time in starting the process. Since he was a police officer, the checks went smoothly. Tom had always been a model citizen and an outstanding cop, and there was nothing in his record that would prevent him from being the baby's foster caregiver. With everything in place, he could start the tough and long adoption process. But Tom was willing to do whatever it took to officially adopt the girl. With the baby in his care, he decided to name her Eddie in honor of his grandmother, with whom he had been very close, but who had unfortunately passed away just a year ago. Although it may seem like Tom was the one who rescued Eddie, the truth was that the girl had also rescued him. Tom had had a rough few years. He had been engaged to the love of his life, Sophia, and was 2 weeks away from getting married when he saw her with another man. When he confronted her, she admitted to having multiple affairs, and Tom ended things right there. Sophia was the only woman he had ever loved, and when she disappeared and left him in their home after the breakup, he couldn't bear all the constant reminders of the life they had shared. So, he requested a transfer at work. That's how he ended up in a new city, adjusting to a completely new life. He had distanced himself from friends and family, and was still getting used to his new coworkers. Lately, he had been feeling lonely and depressed. But now that he had to take care of Eddie, he felt like he had a purpose again. Although the adoption process was tough, knowing he would have Eddie as his daughter made it all worth it. The hospital had estimated that the girl was about 8 months old, but without knowing her exact birthday, Tom decided to mark the day he had rescued her as her birthday. Months later, Tom was finally approved to officially adopt Eddie. The new dad was thrilled and felt that he could now start his new life with his daughter. Being a single father while working as a police officer wasn't easy, but to his surprise, his new colleagues rallied to help. They recommended the best daycare, and his boss even agreed not to give him night shifts while he adjusted to his new life. Watching Eddie grow up was the best thing Tom had ever witnessed. He loved his daughter as if she were biologically his own. They were father and daughter. No matter what, the first time she called him dad, Tom was sure he would never feel happier. He gave her the best life possible, prepared her for school, making sure her reading and writing skills were the best they could be. He took her on the most incredible day trips and was saving up for their first vacation. Sometimes Tom felt guilty that Eddie didn't have a mother, but he had no desire to date after what had happened with Sophia. All his time was dedicated to raising his little girl. At the right time, he would explain everything. But for now, all she needed to know was that it was her and him against the world. Years went by, and Tom saw Eddie start school, make friends, develop hobbies and interests, and become the best daughter he could have ever hoped for. But just before her 10th birthday, a tragedy struck. Eddie and her classmates were on a trip when the bus they were in was hit by a truck. The impact was so strong that everyone on board was gravely injured. The truck had collided head-on with the bus, and Eddie had been seated right in front, so the girl took the brunt of the impact. When emergency workers finally reached her, she was unconscious. Things were about to get even worse. At the hospital, Eddie fell into a coma and had to be connected to life support. When Tom found out about the accident and Eddie's condition, he dropped the phone in shock and broke down in tears. His boss told him to go directly to the hospital and take as much time as he needed. Tom was shaking so much that a coworker offered to drive him to the hospital, worried he might end up having an accident too. When Tom saw Eddie lying in the hospital bed, his heart shattered. His little princess looked so small and vulnerable with all these big noisy machines around her. Tom knew there was no way he would leave her side until she was fully recovered. The hospital agreed to have Tom have a bed in the same room as Eddie, so he could always be by his daughter's side. After running home to grab some belongings, he stayed next to Eddie all day, every day. Even though he knew she was unconscious, Tom believed that some part of Eddie knew her father was there. So he spent all day talking to her, reading her favorite stories out loud, and making plans for all the things they would do when she recovered. Very often though, the nurses would find Tom outside Eddie's room crying. It was clear how much she meant to him, and the nurses were moved by the loving father who wanted to remain positive in front of his daughter, even though she couldn't hear him. 2 weeks after the accident, the doctors had terrible news for Tom. They informed him that Eddie would never recover from her injuries, and the only thing keeping her alive was the life support machine. They said the kindest thing was to disconnect the life support machine and let her go in peace. Tom didn't want any of that, though he couldn't abandon his daughter. Just as his little girl had been abandoned when she was a baby, she was a little fighter, and she would get through this. Tom begged and pleaded with the doctors to leave Eddie on the life support machine. "She will wake up, you'll see," the devastated father told them. The doctor took pity on the pair and decided to let the matter rest a little longer. The longer Eddie remained unconscious, the more Tom could see that his child was not going to wake up. But Tom never lost hope. On her 10th birthday, he wrote her a card and brought her a balloon. He told her that when she was better, he would take her on a trip to Africa. The girl was a big animal lover and had always asked about going on a safari. He promised her he would make her dream come true if she woke up. That night, 10 years to the day that Tom had rescued Eddie from the trash, he lay in the hospital room and cried himself to sleep. But hours later, he woke up to a great commotion in the room. When one of the doctors realized Tom was sitting up in bed, he cheerfully informed him that Eddie was awake. He had to be dreaming, surely. But when Tom jumped out of bed and went to his daughter's bedside, he saw it wasn't a dream. His precious girl was awake. Tom launched himself and planted a huge kiss on Eddie's forehead, tears streaming down his cheeks. But the girl simply returned his gaze, scared and confused. She had no idea who he was. He felt as if he had lost his daughter again. The doctors explained that Eddie needed to rest. Memory loss and confusion were perfectly normal in this phase, and they hoped that under their care the girl would soon recognize her father. Eddie took almost a week to say her first word. Tom was sitting in a chair, reading aloud one of her favorite books, when the girl woke up and turned to look at him. "Daddy," she asked softly. Tom wrapped Eddie in his arms and hugged her tightly, never wanting to let go. His little girl was back. Another month passed before Eddie could be discharged, but her recovery was far from over. Tom dedicated all his time to taking care of her, taking her to her appointments, and continuing her rehabilitation at home. Almost a year after the accident, Eddie was much better. While the family was having dinner, she turned to Tom and said, "Dad, can we go on that safari now?" He was stunned. With everything that had happened, he had almost forgotten that on her 10th birthday, he had promised his daughter a trip to Africa if she woke up. He was surprised she had remembered. Tom wasted no time in planning the trip of their lives. Just a month later, they boarded a plane, ready to embark on their African adventure. Eddie was thrilled, and Tom was overjoyed to see his daughter smiling again. Unfortunately, the trip was doomed from the start. Father and daughter had just stepped off the plane in Africa when they found themselves surrounded by police officers. The police threw Tom to the ground and handcuffed him. The girl screamed and cried as two officers tried to calm her down and take her away from the scene. Eventually, she went willingly, but she was terrified and had no idea where they had taken her father. Little did they know that the police had been waiting for a known child trafficker believed to be on their flight with a smuggled girl from the United States. Tom matched the description of the smuggler. What went unnoticed by everyone was that the smuggler had contacts everywhere. He found out about the plan at the last moment and cancelled his travel plans, leaving Tom as the only single man on the flight with a child. Tom tried to explain that Eddie was his daughter, even showing all the identification he had proving he was a police officer in the US, but the police didn't believe him. They thought falsifying those documents would be easy for a high-level criminal. Tom insisted they should call his boss and even gave them the phone number, which would confirm his identity and the fact that he was a police officer. However, the African police assumed these were elaborate lies. When the man insisted that the girl he was traveling with was his daughter, the police came up with an idea they believed would settle things once and for all. They would do a DNA test. When Tom found out about the plan, panic spread. In the confusion, he had not explained that Eddie was adopted. Now it seemed like he was making excuses. He tried to explain that he hadn't lied, but Eddie was not his biological daughter. He had adopted her as a baby. However, the police were only interested in their plan, believing Tom was lying. They had worked on this case for months and hoped for promotions if Tom was the smuggler. So they took DNA samples from Eddie and Tom and sent them for analysis. Eddie was taken care of in a safe place, but she was worried because no one explained what was happening. No one listened when she insisted the man they had arrested was her father. Meanwhile, Tom knew the DNA test would come back negative, and when it did, he would be in serious trouble. A negative test would imply Eddie was his daughter, but then saying they weren't biologically related would make the police suspect him of child smuggling. A few days later, the DNA test results arrived. When the police showed Tom the results, he was shocked. The test showed Eddie was 100% his biological daughter, but that was impossible. He had found her crying in the trash and rescued her. Now they were telling him she was biologically his daughter. Realizing their mistake, the police contacted Tom's boss, who confirmed his identity and job. Tom and Eddie were immediately released and reunited. They had only been separated for 5 days, but after almost losing her once, it felt like they had been apart their entire lives. Now, the only thing either of them wanted was to go home. Tom had only one thing on his mind during the entire flight back. How had the DNA test come back positive? Given the way they had handled the entire child trafficking case, Tom assumed they had somehow botched the DNA test too, but he couldn't get it out of his head. He had to be sure. So, the day after landing back in the US, Tom took Edie to the hospital where he paid for her to have her own DNA test. Regardless of what it said, Edie was his daughter. But if this one came back positive, Tom had a lot to think about. 2 days later, Tom returned to the hospital and was handed an envelope with the results. To his surprise, the DNA test once again proved that Edie was biologically his daughter. Back home, Tom processed the news. Sophie was the only woman he had been close to in the last 12 years. Unlike her, he had been faithful. There was only one explanation. When Tom had left her, Sophie must have been in the early stages of pregnancy. He had always had a slight suspicion that Sophie was still watching him, but he had no desire to get back with her and have his heart broken again. She must have assumed the baby was his and tracked him down, leaving the child in the trash for him to find. That afternoon, when Edie came home from school, Tom clung to his daughter. She was his flesh and blood, and against all odds, they had been reunited. Edie returned the hug, but thought her father was just being overprotective. After everything that had happened recently, Tom had never told her she was adopted, and now there was even more to the story. He had waited until she was a bit older, but now Tom felt it was time to tell his little princess the true story of her life. Now it's up to you. How do you think Edie reacted to the news? Do you think Tom did the right thing by waiting to tell her she was adopted? We'd love to hear your opinion. So, leave a comment below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.